This is a demonstration of a real-time path tracer that I've been working on. When I say real-time, what I mean is that it runs at interactive rates, so it behaves like a video game. It's running at 60 frames per second, and I can use the arrow keys, for example, to move this light bulb back and forth. So that's what I mean when I call it a real-time path tracer. The path tracing part would require more technical explanation, and I'm going to put that off until later in the video. So this first part of the video, I'm just going to focus on pointing out interesting visual things that path tracing makes possible. And then if you're still interested, you can stick around and watch more of the video where I go into technical details. But there's probably two main things to notice. The first of those, I would say, is the shadows. So these shadows are what I would call soft shadows. What I mean by soft is that there aren't harsh outlines. If you look at the shadow of the blue block, it starts out with a pretty well-defined outline right where the block meets the wall, but then as the shadow gets further and further away from the blue block, then it becomes more spread out and diffused. And so that would be what I'm calling a soft shadow. You also probably notice all the speckly stuff in the shadows. That's what I will call noise in this video, and that is a direct result of using path tracing. So that may or may not bother you. It might bother you more or less depending on your personal preferences, but we'll talk a little bit more about that later in the technical details part. Besides the shadows, the second main thing to notice would be the indirect lighting. And what that means is that light doesn't just come from the direct source from this light bulb, but it also bounces off things. And so I've made these three blocks different colors to make this more obvious. You can see that there's green, red, and blue that is being reflected onto the walls. And so this bright light source is illuminating the bottom parts of the block, and then that's bouncing off onto the wall, and so we can see the color indirectly in the wall there. And if I move the light above the blocks, you can see the opposite happening. Now that indirect bounced light is showing above the blocks onto the wall. And also from this vantage point, the top of the red block is also lighting up the bottom of the blue block and the green block as it gets close. You can see the red there. You can also see this on a bigger scale, so I'm going to change the camera now. I'm going to move it up and also change the field of view. This is a really tall room. There we go. We can see the floor and the ceiling now, and I'll move the light out closer to the middle of the room. As I move it up here to the top, close to the ceiling, you can see that the entire room has sort of a cool blue light to it. But that's going to change as I move the light to the bottom of the room, close to this green floor. Now we get more of a warm, greenish glow around everything. So having this indirect lighting that path tracing makes possible results in a lot of nice, subtle lighting changes that you don't get otherwise. So those are the main things to notice visually. If you want to stick around, please do. The rest of the video I'm going to go into more detail about some of the technical aspects of what makes this possible. What we're looking at here is a recreation of an actual room in my house. So I got a measuring tape and measured all the wall dimensions and took the stats of the paint on the walls and used the same RGB values and reflectance values And that's also a real light bulb that I have. It's 800 lumens with 2700K color temperature. And the goal was for me to be able to generate an image that looked the same as what I perceived when I'm in that room physically, looking with my eyes with that light bulb as the only light source. So the first step in order to do that was to take a photograph and see if I could generate an image that matched that photograph. So here is the actual photograph from that actual room. You'll notice that it looks very orange. Don't worry about that for right now. We'll come back to that in a minute. And then here is the image that I generated to try and match that photograph. So I consider this a great success. It doesn't match exactly. I didn't model any light switches, and there's no specularity on the plastic of the light switches or the faceplate. But for what I was trying to accomplish, this really made me happy. So just to emphasize, I wasn't tweaking values to try and make this look correct. Instead, the goal was to take these real physical values of the walls and paint and light source, and then take the camera values of its position and exposure settings and focal length, and throw those all into my renderer and see what happened. And the result matches pretty well. So let's change the real-time path tracer now to use those same settings that I used to recreate this photograph and see what it looks like. This is what the real-time path tracer looks like when it uses the same settings that I used to try and match the actual photograph. And unfortunately, there are a lot of problems with this image. It really doesn't look very good. So we'll go through one improvement at a time and talk about how to make it look better. The first thing I want to talk about is the orange color. I mentioned earlier that the light bulb I have has a color temperature of 2700 K or Kelvin. And what that means is if you had an old style incandescent light bulb where the way it generated light was by getting really hot, then that little metal tungsten filament in the middle of the bulb would get to a temperature of 2700 K and then emit radiance. And the formulas for calculating what color that should be given some range of spectral radiances are well defined, and if you do those calculations, you end up with a color for human eyes that looks very much like this orange color we see on screen. The problem with this is that this orange color that the equations would predict is not at all the color that our human eyes actually perceive when we see a light that's this bright and this color. It's a really fascinating subject that deserves its own post. I'm just going to give an oversimplified summary, but the issue is that our brains are interfering. So our brains are telling us that we're seeing something different from what our eyes are perceiving. And this is a problem with traditional photography also. If you remember that actual photograph that I showed, it looked orange just like this. And so cameras have had to figure out how to deal with this problem. And the mechanism for doing that is called white balance, sometimes color balance. And we can apply that same strategy to rendered images. So let's look at what this would look like if we applied traditional white balance correction. The colors here are pretty close to what a real camera will produce if you take a photograph in my actual room with this actual light bulb. And it's definitely an improvement over the strong orange that we had before, but the problem is it doesn't really match what it looks like with my own eyes when I'm in that room. It's too cold and lifeless. It feels almost like a black and white photograph, but that's not what it feels like when you're in the room. There are a range of colors that the human brain will consider to be white. And if you're familiar with light bulbs and color temperatures, and you think about the difference between, say, a 2700K light bulb like the one I have, and a 5000K light bulb or a 6000K light bulb, that difference is pretty noticeable. So we would call them all white, but they're not all the same white. And the problem with this traditional camera white balance is it makes everything the same white. These colors are much closer to what my eyes and brain perceive when I'm in my room with the light bulb turned on. It can be a little startling in contrast compared to the previous black and white image. It maybe looks really yellow to you, but when you get used to it, and let your eyes adapt, this does look pretty close to at least what I perceive when I'm in the room. And what I'm showing right now uses the same white balance mechanism, but instead of transforming the orange into pure computer white, it's transforming orange into a color that is close to white, or close to computer white, but more closely represents the color that our brains would perceive. And in order to do that, I've come up with a heuristic where you can give as an input color one of these colors that our human brains will consider to be white, and then as output, I predict a color that I think is pretty close to what we would actually perceive. I just switched to a different technique, although I think the actual difference is visually imperceptible with this simple test scene. I'm still calculating the adapted white color the same way, but instead of using white balance, I'm now just replacing the original light source color with this adapted white color. This initially felt wrong to me because I wanted to do all of the lighting calculations and the way the light interacted with materials with the real physical values, and then do the chromatic adaptation as a post-process using white balance. But not only did I run into some problems with that, the more I thought about it, I thought about this other phenomenon of the human visual system called color constancy. And the way that works is if we know that something is a certain color, if we know that an apple is red, for example, then even if the lighting conditions change, our brains still know that it's red and helps us to perceive it as red. And with that in mind, just changing the light color started to make more sense. It's no longer physically based. It's just relying on me and my heuristic. But I think it seems to work closer to what our brain does when it interferes with what our eyes actually sense. Okay, so we talked about one of the big problems with the image that I was generating, which was that orange color. And we talked about how to make the color of the light look more natural. The next problem that I want to talk about is this big white overexposed blob that's around the light bulb itself. Most of this image that we're looking at looks pretty close to how my eyes perceive the room. But as we get closer to the light bulb itself, it suddenly doesn't look right at all. If you were actually in the room, we can visualize what it would look like by lowering the exposure. So something like this. Now, most of the image is way too dark, but right around where the light bulb itself is looks closer to how I perceive it when I'm in that room. Looking at the actual light bulb is so bright that it hurts your eyes, so that isn't captured well here, but the thing that it does show is that it's easy to tell where the light bulb is. There's no problem differentiating where the light bulb stops and the wall starts. That sphere is really obvious. Now, the walls closest to the light bulb do get kind of bright, so maybe they might look something like that, but you can still easily tell where the sphere is. It's nothing like this, where it's so bright that it just becomes an indistinguishable white blob. The reason that this happens, that it gets so overexposed, is because I'm using physically accurate light luminance values. And so we have a light bulb that emits 800 lumens, and a traditional monitor or TV or phone can't show anything that bright. And so it just becomes overexposed where we're using those accurate values. The way to fix this problem is something called tone mapping in graphics. And tone mapping is its own really interesting subject. It deserves its own post. In this video, I'm going to avoid talking about any of the theory behind tone mapping, and instead I want to just focus on showing visually what tone mapping can do. So when you set exposure values in a camera, one of the things you're doing is implicitly defining something called middle gray, and that middle gray can be visualized. Everything you see here that is not black is in the range of middle gray. And everything you see here is either in that range of middle gray or darker. And so by choosing the exposure settings that I have, I'm saying that after we do tone mapping, everything we see here that isn't black should be the same in the final image. There shouldn't be any changes from tone mapping to what we are currently seeing. Everything that we're seeing now, however, is above that middle gray range. And so this is the stuff that we want tone mapping to change. After tone mapping is done, everything that we're seeing now needs to be compressed into a much smaller dynamic range so that when we look at the final image, we say, oh yeah, I can still see the light bulb. It's still recognizably a bright light bulb, but we don't have this big overexposed blob. There are many different flavors of tone mapping, but none of the ones that I found satisfied all of my requirements. I'm going to show one example of a popular one called ACES, or ACES, and use that to demonstrate some of the things that it did that weren't the behaviors that I wanted. So watch as I transition from this, where it's just overexposing and clipping the highlights, as I transition into ACES, and watch what happens to the middle gray regions and to the overexposed regions. So the area of the image that is above middle gray did get compressed. The overexposed area around the light bulb looks better, but it's still overexposed. You still can't see where the light bulb is. So it's an improvement, but not quite what I was looking for. And then the areas at middle gray and below actually got darker. Now this is a feature and not a bug. This is an intentional part of ACES. It's to try and make things look cinematic. This is exactly how tone mapping in movies works. And it does look nice, but it's not what I'm looking for in this particular project of mine. There's one other thing that I want to show that involves these blocks with color. That's why I brought them back in. Can you see what's happening as the light gets really close to these? The blocks are becoming completely white. They're getting overexposed also. I can bring out the light in front of them, and you can see it now on the front faces too, how that red is going completely to white, the green is going to white, the blue is going to white. This again is a feature, not a bug. This is something that tone mappers talk about all the time. It's called a path to white. But the problem I have is that this is not what happens with bright lights in real life when I'm looking at colors like this with my own eyes. And I've done many, many experiments over the years to verify this. And at least for my eyes, this isn't what happens. So I think that ASUS and similar tone mappers do a really good job of helping a rendered image look like a movie to make it look cinematic. But at least for my current project where I'm trying to emulate what my eyes see when I look at a scene, this doesn't really fit the bill. It imposes its own aesthetic, artistic look on the scene rather than reproduce what my eyes perceive. So this is back again to no tone mapping. And next I will transition to the implementation of tone mapping that I came up with. So again, watch what happens in the overexposed region above middle gray, and watch what happens with the areas below middle gray. So if we look at the light bulb itself, it is no longer the blobby overexposed white mess that we saw before, but we can actually see the outline of the light bulb. It's clear where the walls are and where the light itself are. And if you watched the other areas in the image that were below middle gray, they should have stayed the same as they were before tone mapping, which is exactly what I wanted. After I got this implemented, I decided to change the exposure a little bit. So this exposure is the same that we've seen in all these visualizations, the same that I used for the actual photograph. But once I had HDR working the way that I liked and experimented, I decided that a brighter exposure like this looked a little bit closer to how I perceived things. So the walls now do get a bit saturated, which is also how they look to my eyes in real life, but you can still tell where the light bulb is. Let me move it now up close to these blocks so we can see what happens when it gets close. So the blocks do get lighter, which is good. That's exactly what we want. You can tell that the light is close to them, but they don't get blown out to white. So this looks much closer to me how I perceive this kind of effect. I can also bring the light out in front like we had before, see what it looks like on their front faces. So good. This looks pretty accurate to me, even though I don't actually have blocks of these colors attached to the wall in my room, but just the effect of having a bright light close to saturated colors, this looks pretty close to me. Even though the tone mapping works really well, there's still something missing. And if I bring the light bulb out to the middle of the room like this, it no longer looks like it's a bright light. It maybe looks like it's a circle that's been painted an off-white color, but it doesn't look like it's emitting any light, and certainly not bright light. By adding something called bloom, however, our eyes are tricked into thinking that, yes, this is a bright light. Even though the light being emitted from the TV or monitor isn't any brighter than it was before with what I just showed, having these visual cues tricks our eyes into recognizing that, yes, this is a bright light. Now, unfortunately, looking at the light here in this room with just the white walls doesn't look particularly good. But by removing the walls and just showing the light bulb against a black background, it's easier to see what the bloom is actually doing. Now, there's nothing special at all about my bloom implementation. It's exactly what everyone else in the industry is doing. The one nice thing about it is by having my test room that I tweaked so that it matched what my eyes perceived, then I was also able to tweak the bloom to try and match the way that the bloom looked with this specific 800 lumen light bulb to my eyes when I was in the room. So those are the improvements I've made to the rendering to make it look more closer to how my brain and eyes experience it when I'm actually in this room. The orange light has been transformed into an adapted warm white color. Tone mapping has been used to take that wide range of really bright values and compress them into something that a traditional TV and monitor can show. And then bloom has been added to really bright things to give our eyes a visual cue so that we recognize that these are bright lights, even though the light coming from the TV is actually not very bright. And it's really cool now. I have this fake room in software, and I can move this fake light bulb around, but it looks really similar to when I'm in the real room, moving the real light bulb around. But there is still one big star of the show that we haven't talked about, and that is the path tracing itself, which is really what makes this all possible. So for the final part of this video, I want to spend some time visualizing what the path tracing is actually doing. Here I've disabled everything that makes path tracing interesting, and you'll notice that the lighting doesn't look as good. If I move the light around, it seems like it gets dark really quickly, and even when it does light up the walls, the lighting doesn't have the same quality and subtlety that we've seen earlier in the video. This kind of lighting is traditional, simple, classic computer graphics lighting. It's the kind of lighting that I learned to do in school, for example. There is, however, one interesting thing I'm using ray tracing for. And so I'm going to take a screenshot and put it big on screen. So what we're seeing here is just a single frame. And if you look at the edges of the blocks, you can see all these little bumps. It's like pixels are out of place. And this is an example of the noise that I've talked about earlier in the video. What I'm doing is using ray tracing to do anti-aliasing. And this is a pattern that we'll notice repeatedly with path tracing. We don't have all of the computational power that we'd like in order to do all the calculations and make things look as good as we would like. But using this technique of adding noise and changing things every frame means that we can help the brain to ignore the lack of information and fill in the gaps. And so it's as if the brain sees more information than is really there. The lighting is the same, but I've added shadows. And notice that the outlines of the shadows are really harsh. There's a really strong, definite boundary, a hard line that separates things that are in shadow and things that are out of shadow. And this is because even though the light bulb still looks like a sphere visually, the lighting calculations that I'm doing are treating it as a single point in space. With ray tracing, it's pretty simple to use a sphere area light instead of a point light. So watch the outlines of the shadows and see how they change when I switch to the soft shadows. Now the light is being calculated with an actual sphere instead of just a single point in space. And you can see that the outlines of the shadows aren't harsh anymore. We have soft shadows. Now the noise is really visible in the soft areas of the shadows, and it's for the same reason that we saw with anti-aliasing. We don't have enough computational power to actually compute the soft shadows correctly every frame. So instead, what we do is calculate just part of them every frame. And then every frame calculates a different part, and our brains see the noise and help us to fill in the real correct shape of the soft shadows. But even with the soft outlines, there's still a real noticeable problem with these shadows, which is that they're so dark. Once something is completely in shadow, it's completely in shadow. It's all black. You can't see anything. And the most obvious way to see this is to look at the faces of the blocks themselves. If I move the light out into the room a little bit, then we can see the colors on those blocks. But once I start moving it closer to the wall, suddenly the faces of the blocks are no longer illuminated. In real life, this isn't what it looks like. In real life, light bounces and reflects off of surfaces, and so we have indirect lighting like we've talked about before. So watch the shadows and see what happens when I enable a single bounce of indirect lighting. Just adding this single bounce of indirect lighting makes an enormous difference. No longer are things in shadow completely black. We can see the walls in shadow. We can see the faces of the blocks. It's really incredible how much of a difference it makes. And even the lighting itself, the stuff not in shadow, has had a significant upgrade. If you remember before, when there was just direct lighting, the light seemed like it got dark way too quickly. And now, with this one bounce of indirect lighting, the quality of the light itself looks more like what we would expect and what we experience in real life. Adding this indirect lighting has introduced more noise into the image. You can maybe see it on the walls. And it's for the same reason that the other noise has happened that we've talked about. What is actually happening is when a single ray of light hits a single point on a surface, that ray of light bounces and reflects in all directions in a hemisphere around that intersection point. So it doesn't just bounce once, like might happen with a mirror. It doesn't just bounce multiple times, but it is literally bouncing in all possible directions. And so that is definitely more than we can calculate in a single frame if we want to run at 60 frames per second. But again, noise to the rescue. We can use probability to carefully choose which directions we want to use in a single frame, and then by using different directions in different frames and using noise, our brains can help us fill in the gaps. And so what we perceive is as if every intersection with a ray of light against any point on the surface is bouncing in all directions. It's really incredible. It feels like magic to me that we can do this in real time. I've talked about having a single bounce, and even though that bounce happens in all directions, in real life it doesn't stop there. So light will bounce and then it will eventually hit another surface and bounce again, and it will keep bouncing. And so what we're looking at now is only the very first indirect bounce, but watch what happens as we change this and allow light to bounce 2 times. Adding a second bounce definitely made things look better, but not nearly to the same extent that adding that first bounce did. The improvement is not nearly as dramatic. And the flip side to that is that the second bounce has increased the noise in the image. That may not come through well in YouTube with the video compression, but there are definitely trade-offs to consider. If we want it to be as accurate as possible, then we would keep adding more bounces. And doing that will definitely make things look more accurate, but the problem is not only does it become more of a performance penalty the more you add, but the improvements for each additional bounce become less and less. And the way I feel currently is that what we're looking at now, these 2 bounces, is probably the sweet spot for real time. It doesn't look as good as it could, but I think it gives an honest representation of what reality would look like. And the good thing is it still remains relatively affordable, computationally speaking. Just in case you're curious, here's an example of allowing a lot more bounces and also reducing the noise at the first bounce. And it definitely looks beautiful, but you can tell that my GPU can no longer run at 60 frames per second. And it also doesn't get rid of the noise entirely. Comparing this with the previous version, it's obvious that this is better, but I still don't know if I weren't doing direct comparisons, how much I would miss just having the two bounces. And with that, we've made it to the end. If you're still watching, then congratulations on your endurance. Being able to work on these features has been really fun for me. Some of them I've wanted to do for years and just haven't had the opportunity, but the most exciting thing about the end product is that having this baseline of the boring white room allows me to make imaginary rooms like this one and be relatively confident that this is what it would actually look like if a room like this really existed. I mentioned before, but the fact that we can do path tracing in real time and interactively like this feels like magic to me. It feels too good to be true. It's really cool. Hopefully you have gained a greater appreciation of path tracing and the other graphics techniques as we've gone through all of them, and maybe even you can recognize some of them here on this end screen that we've talked about as I move the light bulb around. Thank you so much for watching.